Impact Texas, featuring stories and interviews with difference makers, those who make an impact right here in Dallas-Fort Worth, the state of Texas, the U.S., and all around the globe.
My name's Hondo. Each week we bring you events and organizations, issues, and concerns all around North Texas, making a difference and having an impact on the lives of each and every one of us. Let me throw out a stat before we get started. Last year, 2014, Texas Department of Family Services, DFPS, had a legal responsibility for a total of 4,300 children in Dallas County. That number obviously went up from 2013. All of these kids had been removed from their homes and brought into substitute care. Now, what would that substitute care be? Well, that would be, amongst others, our friends here at Dallas CASA who have been doing what they do for 35 years. You know, recently we talked about the troubles that Tarrant County had in the area of child abuse in 2014 and how they led the state. Dallas probably thought, whoa, man, we're good, right? We're golden. Not so much. So that's what we're going to talk about over the next 30 minutes. We do have some light at the end of the tunnel, though. Their annual program, Parade of Playhouses, is going on. I'll tell you how you can be involved in that and where it's going on. It actually starts this weekend. So we'll talk about all of that over the next 30 minutes with my friend and the CEO for Dallas CASA, Kathleen LaValle. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having us.
You are sure welcome. By the way, if you want to hit them up online, you can do so at dallascasa.org. dallascasa.org, and I've got my friend over here also, Tim. Now, Tim, how are you?
I'm doing fine today, thanks.
You are unique. You have been volunteering here for, 13 years now?
13 years, yeah.
And you have an interesting story. You obviously retired from a huge corporate background, so I want to talk to you in a little bit about how your corporate background kind of blended in and helped out what you're doing here specifically with Dallas CASA. Also, something, and I swear I do this every single week, it seems like somehow this discussion comes up. So let's just start with the beginning. How did you find Dallas CASA?
I was working in San Diego, which is where I lived for 35 years, and I was working for United Way there after leaving the large telecommunications company I worked for. And I had a friend who knew I was moving back to Dallas since I was raised here. She said, you ought to look up Dallas CASA for some of your volunteer time. I did it, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. You got hooked, right?
I did get hooked. I got hooked on the organization, the people, the kids, the whole thing.
And the mission for what they stand for and have stood for a long time, decades. And that's where I was going with this. Every week, doesn't matter whether we're talking about child abuse, whether we're talking about hunger, I could be talking to somebody at the food bank, right? Everybody I talk to, whether it's a communications director, whether it's the CEO, which I'm about to ask here in a moment, everybody says, man, you know what? Either a friend led me onto it, or I was in between jobs, or I just left a corporate career, and so I volunteered for a while, or I checked this program out, and I got hooked. And the next thing you know, you're volunteering for 13 years, right? Or you're running the place, like you. Now, you've been here for about a year and a half in the CEO role, but you've also been an advocate for Dallas CASA for how long?
Well, I've been on the board of directors for 12 years.
For 12 years. And how did you find Dallas CASA?
I was attending a luncheon that was hosted by Attorneys Serving Community, and the beneficiary of that luncheon was Dallas CASA, court-appointed special advocates, and it was similar to Tim. Once you learn about the organization, it's very easy to get hooked.
It is very easy to get hooked. I hear that week after week after week, you know. It's just like, man, and that's how you know when your goals and what's important to you line up with the mission, and when those two meet, you're here for forever, right? So, I mean, that's pretty cool, and the beneficiary of all of that, of course, are the children that we're talking about. DallasCASA.org is the website. So let's talk about these 4,300 kids in Dallas County alone. I mentioned that it was an increase. It's nearly a 10% increase over 2013. So what's going on? Clearly, I think part of this has to be, let's look at the silver lining a little bit of this. Much as when I talked with Paige Flink over at the Family Place when we were talking about domestic violence, right? Or even when we talked with Alliance for Children in Fort Worth about this horrific number that came out about Tarrant County leading the state. Part of this, I have to believe, is that topics such as domestic violence, topics such as child abuse, sexual abuse, are not as taboo as they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So some of that spike has to be because people are coming forward, but that's probably not all of it, right?
So in 2014, we had a 10% increase in the allegations of child abuse and neglect. I think it's because we're more sensitive, we're more educated to the signs of abuse, and I think that there's more media attention to it in professional sports and elsewhere. And so I think that really has kind of raised the awareness and makes it more likely that we're going to see problems detected and hopefully detected earlier. One of the interesting shifts from 2013 to 2014 was that the highest number of reporters of child abuse changed. In 2013, it was medical professionals. In 2014, it was educators. And I would much rather have a school teacher notice a difference in a child's behavior. They become withdrawn. They see signs of abuse. I'd much rather have it be that teacher than the doctor or the nurse in the ER. So I'm trying to, as you referenced, the silver lining, trying to look at this increase as we've gotten better as a community at protecting our children.
Absolutely. Again, my name's Hondo. It's Impact Texas, hanging out at Dallas CASA. Kathleen LaValle is my friend and the Chief Executive Director here at the Dallas CASA. DallasCASA.org is the website. So you basically kind of echoed to a degree what I was saying, is that it's not necessarily that we had an 8-10% increase in children that were abused, but more people are coming forward, right? And I totally agree with something you just said, and that was also echoed in the numbers from Fort Worth, from Tarrant County, all of Tarrant County, not just Fort Worth. Their highest number of reporters were educators, were the schools, which is very important. Like you said, stop and think about it for a minute. If you're finding out that your child was abused sexually, physically, whatever the situation might have been, regardless, and it's coming from a doctor, a little bit different situation than if the teacher or a counselor pulls mom and dad aside or calls mom or dad and says, hey, maybe we need to have a conference, like talk to you about a couple things, and here's some things that I see either in the behavior, maybe not physical signs, but just some behavior traits from that child that might be something you want to look at, which may be preventing that trip to the doctor.
Right. And so I think, when you see an indication of child abuse and you have reason to believe that the child has been sexually, physically abused, then there is actually a hotline to report abuse. And so that's on our website, which is at DallasCASA.org. And so I do think that we have more individuals who feel like it is their community responsibility to report abuse when they see the symptoms of trauma.
Let's talk about this real quick. I'm obviously very familiar with Dallas CASA and the work that you all have been doing now for 35 years. A lot of folks may not be. In fact, they may not even know what CASA stands for. So let's talk about what Dallas CASA is at its basic foundation and kind of where all this got started. Because really, Dallas is one of a select few, when this started back in 1980, a handful were trusted with this huge responsibility where these kids are concerned. And it's just exploded over 35 years. So kind of talk about kind of the history of Dallas CASA and really what you all are at the foundation.
Sure. So Dallas CASA was one of 3 CASA programs nationally to be part of a pilot that was modeled after a very successful program in Seattle, Washington. The judge in Seattle was hearing child welfare cases and became frustrated because he felt like the caseworkers and the attorneys were bringing him almost cookie cutter kind of reports about the circumstances of individual children. So he went out into the community and recruited volunteers to really make a connection with those children on a one-on-one basis. They're formally appointed to the case by the judge, and they try to understand the detailed circumstances of the child's temporary placement, making sure that they're protected from further harm, checking out whether or not they're getting the educational services they need and the therapeutic services so they can begin to heal from the trauma. So that was back in 35 years ago, and the model has been very, very successful. It's a way for the community to come off the sidelines and really respond to child abuse and neglect rather than just be outraged by it. So the whole model is to have community volunteers who are trained and supervised by our professional staff. So you're not out there doing this on your own. You actually are paired one-on-one with a volunteer supervisor who has that background in social services and educational specialties that can really bring the extra degree of expertise to this advocacy assignment. And so what you're really doing is being the eyes and ears of a judge, and ultimately making a recommendation about whether the temporary placement is appropriate and whether it's safe for the child to return home, because that's what we want to happen if it's possible. If it's not possible, then the volunteer advocate is able to make a recommendation to the judge about what are the alternatives for that child to grow up in a safe and loving home.
There's a couple things I want to talk to you about where that's concerned. One, it has to be in everybody's best interest. The family, right? The extended family of that child who still cares about that child, clearly. Society. And the child, that somebody like Dallas CASA or CASA nationwide is stepping in to be that advocate for the child. Otherwise, what happens? You got a judge making a decision based on some facts or some stats on a piece of paper, right? And we all know how the legal system works, right? For better or worse. I mean, really, seriously, let's just call it like it is. They've got, whether it's prosecution or defense, they're both trying to do their job, right? And sometimes that's not always in the best interest of the child. So if you've got somebody like an advocate with CASA speaking up for that child, then the judge can say, okay, you're reputable. Why do you think this is in the best interest of the child? Why should I not just take the child and put him in foster care? Send him to grandma's house? Whatever the situation might be, tell me your opinion. Whereas if CASA's not involved, that child's not going to have that opportunity to speak up and say what's in their best interest.
And that's exactly right. And what's unique about the CASA role is that our volunteer advocates are the only unpaid stakeholders in that process. And I heard one of our juvenile judges say recently that that's why she gives so much weight to the recommendation of the CASA volunteer. One, because they are a volunteer, they have no agenda, and they are so single-mindedly attuned to what's in the best interest of that child. In the short term, this child who's been navigating through this complicated child welfare system is going to feel less alone because you're there. They're going to come to rely upon seeing you. We asked our volunteers to visit with the children at least once a month. They're going to come to depend upon you. And through that, maybe that capacity to trust an adult that they shut down a long time ago because of what they've gone through, the trauma, maybe that starts to rebuild. And so I think when individuals see that they can have an immediate impact and also, ignite that potential for long-term impact, maybe even breaking a cycle of abuse, we find that the commitment becomes very strong to taking on this role.
That's going to be my next question. And by the way, again, my name's Hondo. It's Impact Texas, hanging out at Dallas CASA, dallascasa.org. They have been around for 35 years, just doing incredible things. My friend is the CEO here at the Dallas CASA, Kathleen LaValle. You mentioned that these kids and the things that they have gone through that led them to going through this legal system. And then if they have to navigate this alone, I mean, we're talking literally a lot of these are kids, not 17, 18 kids. We're talking kids. And, just the thought of them having to navigate through this alone and dealing with judges and all this other stuff that they're not going to have any faith in whatsoever, that they're going to do what's best for them, right? Well, you don't know my problems. You don't know what I've gone through. You don't know anything about me. So they've got this advocate that, hey, I'm on your side, right? I'm going to do what's best for you. More than anything, that is going to, I would think, put a sense of calmness and understanding and peace and trust in that child's mind after a certain period of time. It's not going to happen overnight, right? I'm not going to volunteer tomorrow to be a CASA advocate and walk in and little Jimmy's going to be like, "What's up, Hondo? I listen to you on the air all the time. You and I are going to be pals. You got my back. I understand." It's not going to happen like that. But over time, you build up trust with this child, and they know that they've got your back. And then in turn, the hope is, like you mentioned earlier, the long-term hope is that child sees what that advocate did and says, enough is enough. And that cycle of abuse, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's physical abuse, whether it's neglect. Neglect is an abuse, right? Not all of these kids were sexually abused or physically beat up. Some of them end up where they're at purely by neglect, because mom's out doing whatever she's doing, or dad's not around anyway, so the kid's just like, well, screw it, I'm going to go get in trouble, basically. And so by having this advocate on their side and advocating for them, and the child sees what they're doing on their behalf, hopefully that builds up a sense in the mindset of that child that, you know what, they went to bat for me, they didn't have to, and enough is enough.
We have incredible stories to back up just that image. And you're so right. This isn't an overnight process, but we had a young woman who was at a residential treatment center in Houston. She's still under the court jurisdiction in Dallas County, so our volunteer was assigned to them. Well, she ran away. And the volunteer advocate went down to Houston, drove down to Houston, and hung up flyers asking this child, when she's 17 years old, to call her on her cell phone. Put these flyers up on Walmart's, on CVS, and the young woman saw the flyer. And because of that, she came back into the residential treatment center. She just was completely overwhelmed and almost in disbelief that somebody cared enough about her to make that effort. And that's the kind of demonstration of commitment and concern and caring that really does begin to start to restore that child's ability to trust. And you were saying the different ages. So the average age of a child in protective care in Dallas County that we serve is about 6.
Six?
Yes, many of the kids, and where we see a real increase, are in the 0 to 1 year, because if mom has a drug addiction problem and the substance passes to the child, and so you have a baby born addicted to a substance, and that's it's a growing problem, and one that is very, very, very difficult to address.
Well, it's also just more proof that we mentioned last year. I believe it was almost 300 new volunteers that you all trained and recruited here at Dallas CASA, which, again, we're talking about numbers, 35% increase over 2013. That's great, as long as the 35% increase of volunteers that are going out and going to bat for these kids is greater than the number of kids are getting into the judicial system to begin with, right? And that's where it's so complicated and such a mess, is trying to train the advocates so they can go out and advocate on behalf of these kids, and at the same time campaigning, if you will, and educating the public on what needs to be done to stop the cycle of abuse to begin with.
Well, right. And so, I mean, it all goes back to awareness, right? I mean, it is a question of having the kind of conversations in our community that are going to make us more aware, and also where we have a community that really takes ownership of an issue. We're on track right now to be the largest community in the country to serve 100% of children in protective care through a nonprofit CASA program. That would be an extraordinary accomplishment for our community. I'm already so proud at the number we serve today, but the thought that Dallas would be known, that have that reputation and that accolade, I think it's just extraordinary, and we owe so much to our dedicated volunteer advocates, some of whom have been with us for 15, 20 years, and they come back, and every case is different, and everyone has its own difficulties, and they're just so committed. And it's really, those are the people that we really owe our greatest gratitude toward. And we have a very, very generous community that's helping us build this facility and hire the professional staff. Tim was actually a volunteer supervisor for us, and was a tremendous contributor on our staff. So he has been both the volunteer advocate and a supervisor.
And then I want to ask you about this real quick, Tim, because we were talking about this off mic before we started the interview. So talk about how your corporate world, if you will, aligned with what you're doing here as a volunteer with CASA.
Sure. I told you I worked for a large telecommunications company for 32 years. And during that time, I was a union representative representing the working people who were employed by that company. During that period of time, I got a lot of great experience working with company leaders and attorneys, doing bargaining, negotiating, grievance processing, arbitrations. And I think that kind of experience seemed to translate very nicely to my work at CASA. I wasn't really aware of that when I first started volunteering at CASA, but it's turned out that it was very helpful.
Right. It was just easy to transfer, right? Or to take what you were doing as a corporate world and it kind of just translated into what you're doing here without you ever going, hey, this is kind of the same thing. It was easy to do here. And then before you realize, you're like, oh, that's kind of the same thing I was doing in the corporate world.
Yeah, the skills that I learned during that 32 years and the people that I worked with certainly translated very well into helping kids and advising judges and working with the many people that you work with when you're working on a case, such as Child Protective Services, caseworkers, attorneys that are representing children, attorneys that are representing families and families themselves. So the skills were translated very nicely.
Absolutely. And that's one thing too, Kathleen, is that we mentioned earlier in the onset that there's a lot of folks out there, if you ask anybody who care about children, they're not going to say, well, no, they do. They want to help out. But a lot of them, A, don't know the resources, right? But B, much like Tim was just alluding to, whether he realized it or not, a lot of them don't realize they already have the skills from their corporate experience to do what it takes to help you guys out on a daily basis.
Well, that's right, and it's not just the corporate backgrounds that can be such a tremendous foundation for being a volunteer advocate. We have teachers, we have individuals in medical professions, other helping professions, social workers and psychologists. But it is always amazing to me what a collection of different backgrounds are attracted to this volunteer advocate role. There really isn't one profile. It requires absolutely no background in legal processes whatsoever. And we really do have advocates who come from really every walk of life. I think the common elements are that they're compassionate, that they're not willing to be sitting on the sidelines and passive about something that they find very troubling, and they are persistent. It's a complicated system. It can be frustrating at times. It may not work as quickly as you'd like it to, And so it really takes someone who has that persistence, that commitment, who really just doesn't give up. I mean, I think that, I don't know, Tim, if you agree, if that's kind of the elements of our very best advocates are that they just, they don't get frustrated. They don't get to the point where they give up. They keep at it, and they're persistent. And it's really that persistence that the children see. And I think it really is a way to help them regain trust that it is, I'm a priority in somebody's life. I may not have been in my earlier years, but I am right now. I am a priority.
Which may be the first time. I was just going to say, which may be the first time that child ever feels like that. Let's talk about this. Let's throw out some good news. So NorthPark, love that place. Hard to believe they've been around for 50 years, longer than I've been around. But this Parade of Playhouses that Dallas CASA has been doing now for 20 years, kicked off Friday, and it's running for quite a while. So let's talk about that. There's 16 of these houses, and they're huge. Talk about this.
Okay, so we have 16 adorable playhouses out at NorthPark right now, and they'll be on display until they're raffled off on July 26th. And they're designed and built by professionals. I think you'll be amazed at the quality of the construction, and so they're all kind of like 8x8. So they're child size. It's a child size. It's symbolic of us wanting to have a safe place for children to live, and that's why it's such a good fit with the CASA mission. But when you're out there, what you see is the excitement of these young children. They're dragging their parents over to buy a $5 raffle ticket, and we have ways you can vote for your favorite playhouse this year by texting. So there's a lot of excitement, and it also just gives us an opportunity. We have volunteer advocates who actually help us with the sale of the raffle tickets, and it's a great chance to ask them about what they do and try to imagine yourself in that role.
And a couple things. I love two things. One, I love how they are spread out all throughout NorthPark, right? So you get an exercise, which is good for everybody involved because you're walking around and you're looking at all these. The second thing I really loved about it, I know last year, I can't tell you how much money, you don't want me to tell you how much money I threw in raffle tickets. Trying to get this up
You and others.
Playhouse, I'm telling you, that thing was full. And I actually took my mom over to NorthPark last year. We were walking around, and she's like, well, maybe we want to No, I want the up one. I want that one. And it was for my niece. But she was 5 at the time, and it came to a point where my mom was like, is this house for you or for Kylie? And I was like, we're the same height. What's the difference? But I love how each year the houses that are built are relevant to what's going on. Just as an example, so last year I mentioned The Up, and that movie was, if you haven't seen that movie, you need to see it. But this year there's a Frozen castle. I mean, ask any 6-year-old. Let it go. Yeah. There's a ski lodge. Don't laugh. There's a movie theater. There's all kinds of cool stuff. So these are not just little throw together pieces of cardboard or wood, right? They just, well, let's just throw something together and call it a playhouse. These are nicer than your apartment, trust me. And you need to check them out. And they're at NorthPark going on. That started yesterday. So if you haven't already been, you probably need to go this weekend. Going on through the 26th. And then on the 26th, they raffle it. And how does that work?
So it's 4 o'clock. It's a Sunday afternoon, and we'll raffle off and select the winner. Just we put it in a bin and mix them around and pick the winner. Actually, we have children who are in attendance come and pick out the winning ticket, and then you get a phone call. You don't have to be there, and as long as you're within the radius, we also deliver the home to your house.
This has been Impact Texas. Special thanks to my friend and CEO here at Dallas CASA, Kathleen LaValle. DallasCASA.org. Stand up for abused children. Go out and make it a great week. and dare to care.
This has been Impact Texas, a public affairs radio production for Cumulus Radio Dallas-Fort Worth. Got a high-impact interview idea? We want to share your story. Contact 214-525-2505. That's 214-525-2505. Impact Texas. Weekends at the same time from Cumulus Radio Dallas-Fort Worth.